I'm Tom Strange, Chief Curator for the Sigel Music Museum, and today we're at the storage facility for the Sigel Music Museum, and we are going to start talking about some of the wonderful instruments that Marlowe Sigel acquired over his lifetime and which are now part of the permanent collection for the museum. Marlowe had discriminating taste, and he had the resources to acquire some of the most important musical instruments that came available during the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s. And so over that time period, he was able to acquire some wonderful things. And today I thought I would start with two of the most wonderful of the things, one of which you rarely get a chance to see very much of, and I thought, well, let's go inside a little bit. And then on the other one, the Stein Forte Piano, many copies of this particular instrument exist out there. We're going to be able to talk about the original today. Let's start with our first instrument, which as you see me sitting next to it, you're going, really, seriously, what is that? Well, it looks for all the world like one of those Demi lune pier tables that were very popular in the 18th century. But in this case, I'm going to show you that this is actually a very small piano built into this Demi lune case, the product of William Southwell. So William Southwell was an extremely inventive individual, born on or around 1736-37, died in 1822, began life as a furniture maker, and then at some point traveled to Dublin and began making pianos with Ferdinand Weber in Dublin. So spent about 10 years with Weber from 1772 to about 1782, and then began making things on his own. And one of the first things that he came out with was this wonderful creation. So just a little bit more about Southwell, because he's so important, and yet we don't really talk about Southwell instruments all that much because there are, about 15 still extant, but compared to the importance of the individual, I think just his instruments alone don't represent him. The idea of building a piano into a shape like this is unique to Southwell. No one else ever tried to do it, and I think for good reason, because it's hard to do, and the product was something of its time. But being inventive, he continued to work on things, and if I look behind me, yes, many of you have seen the square pianos out there with the vents in the end, these cut fret vents. These he called sono vents, and this was a development by William Southwell, part of his 1794 patent. So we have that. In that same patent, he came out with the first 5.5 octave square piano, where the keys come up through a little slot in the back of the soundboard. I will tell you that 25 years ago when I first saw that, I thought, well, this is something that somebody has kludged together. But then when you see how well it works, and you realize, of course, that it's repeated thousands and thousands of times, you understand that this was one of the designs. So the idea of the sono vents, the 5.5 octaves, and the wire-guided damper, which we still use on pianos today.
Michael Tzolka sends his greetings.
Greetings, brother. Glad to have you. So for this piano, as it turns out, we know who first owned this. So here's a picture. I apologize, it's in black and white, but this is Elizabeth Wrottesley. And Elizabeth Wrottesley was the Duchess of Grafton. And this was her instrument, part of apparently a pair that she had purchased. She was a famous beauty in her youth and even into her maturity. And she was famous for liking things that were fancy. And this was about as fancy as it gets. So let's look a little bit more into this instrument. I'm going to raise the lid, and you can see that we have all this lovely marquetry on the top of the lid. The thing is put together in yew burl, mahogany, satin wood, tulip wood, and of course the lists go on. So as I've raised the lid, you can see there's marquetry nicely reflected on the inside. And then we notice that this comes up and over. Aha! And then we can open that up, and here we have a lovely keyboard, 5-octave keyboard, designed for a lady to play, and then when it's all closed back up again, the piano essentially disappears. We have a little bit of tone control. So underneath this piano is a knee lever. I have taken it off because I want to actually draw the action so that you guys can see the true inventive nature that's going on here. But this knee lever would fit right under here, and then so discreetly you can raise up this set of louvers to the side here. So I'm going to pull on this a second, and you can see the louvers coming up, just like that. And when we do this, at the same time, the dampers are lifted. So in the 18th century, they often referred to the sustain pedal that we normally think of as just for sustain as the Forte pedal. Well, here is an example where it certainly was the Forte pedal, because not only would you raise the dampers, but you would have lifted this Venetian swell. And in order to make it all work properly, we fitted a small thin board over the strings, completely covering the strings, so that when you're playing this thing under normal conditions, well, all the sound is pretty much boxed up, and then there's a real dramatic effect as you raise these dampers, or raise this louver. So let me talk about the dampers a second. The dampers are really interesting. It's a damper design that is unlike anything else that's quite out there. At the time that this was being made, most of the dampers were the lever damper. So it's like a wooden lever that comes out. It's got a pad on the end. Here's my string, and I would damp it. And then I have a little post that comes up. So as I push the key down, the post comes up and it lifts the lever up. This was very common and were fitted through almost all the pianos. This one's somewhat different. So I've taken it off its hinges. And then what we have here is a series of cast pewter birds, sort of like peacocks. And they're so well done that you can even see the little beak and the eyes. And as each note would be played, then the little bird goes down like he's pecking at something on the ground. And then underneath, you can see the little dampers are like this. And so the sticker comes up and grabs the back of the tail and lifts the damper up, and the bird flies forward and pecks at the string. This certainly would have amused the children. Not sure, other than just total fancy, why it would have been included like that. Now, in order to show you a little bit more about this, I want to actually draw the action on this, and prepare to be surprised. So, in order to do the action for this sort of piano, you first have to remove all the little stickers that come up and grab the bird's tail. So I've taken those out, and they're all in order, and we put them on our little styrofoam planchet, and then we can put those right back when we get done here. I'm going to take out this rod because it actually goes through the action itself. So that's the little rod that the knee lever holds onto and raises those Venetian swell. All right. So most of you are familiar with the German action. And if you're not, I'll just tell you that the English action, the hammer faces away from the person, and as you are pushing down the note, a little jack comes up and grabs the base of the hammer shank and throws the hammer up at the string, and that's called the English single action. And at the time this piano was built, around 1785, that's really the only action that there is out there. Southwell has given us something a little different, though. I'm going to show you this. This is the little name board, and it says, Southwell Fesset. It doesn't have the Dublin on there, but we know that this was actually made in Ireland. And then in the front is this little apron, and it screws in and it comes right out just like that. So here's the apron. And then this thing is on a sled, just like a German piano would have been. So this little sled, very thin. It doesn't really raise the action all that much, but it brings it up perhaps 3/4 of an inch. Closer to, 3/4 of an inch would be about right. And so that little sled is under there, and it comes out. And then, as you guys know, whenever you're drawing the action, you want to make sure that you've gotten things as down as you can. Let's see if I can draw this action out at this point. And here we go. So inside, we have this. And if you guys can see, it's a little trail mechanic action, so that as the key is pushed in, the tail of the hammer shank grabs a little leather piece that's that's overhead and just knocks it up, just like that. Well, that works pretty well, actually. Not too shabby. Very, very simple. There's no escapement. There's no intent for escapement. And then, in order to adjust how high up the hammer comes, there's a screw that goes through a plate into a leather piece, and this beak here captures the leather piece and grabs it, so you can set it so you're not blocking the hammers, and the whole thing is working. There really isn't anything else out there that I know of, and you guys are welcome to chime in, because many of you are experts on this sort of action. I don't know of another action that works quite this way. Normally, with the little South German actions or any of those type, they have a rail sitting up here, and then that rail is sort of fixed, and it sets the how far the hammer is going to come up. I've never seen one where there's a plate sort of overhead with screws through each one for each key, and then adjusting a hard leather bit to make this grab. So the sound on these little instruments like this, are going to be, pretty doggone faint. There's only a tiny, tiny soundboard, and I suspect the whole idea for this was not so much, how much volume we could get out of it, but just the charm and the delight of finding a little piano built into such an instrument, and then the fact that he has approached the hammer action system, damper system, so ingeniously, I think is very, very interesting. As far as the building of this, if you read in the descriptions of these kind of things, you'll find a William Moore is brought up, quite frequently as quote, the builder of these, and maybe Southwell did the action. I think it's pretty clear from this burrow yew-wood use, which was sort of idiomatic of what Moore was doing, and also James Wisdom or John Wisdom was doing that in Dublin. That it was a design style that was really, really popular. I will tell you though that if you're a furniture maker, you don't really know anything about building pianos, and if you're a piano maker, you're probably not building just regular furniture. There's a lot that has to go in. This whole thing has to be designed exactly so, and even more particularly on a little instrument like this, to make anything work. So I have no doubt that William Moore in Dublin was in some way, shape, or form connected with what was going on here. In 1789, he advertised that he was overseeing a piano manufactory, and it could have been from making exactly these sort of things, but I think perhaps it's too much to say that William Moore is responsible for building this. I believe that what we have here is really William Southwell doing the work, and perhaps Moore's shop is astute at applying veneers. Some of these are very difficult to work with, and so that would I think make a lot of sense. We tend to read where Duncan Fife was building the cases for the pianos for John Geib and Son, and yet Geib never mentions it, Fife never mentions it, and the only thing that connects the two is a design style that was readily available. They were just down the blocks from each other. So we often think of well, you must have had professional help or something when you're talking about these early builders, but I believe that they were quite good at what they were doing. Well, this is the little William Southwell Demi lune piano, and it's certainly going to be one of our highlights on display when we open Sensational Sigil. So I'm very much looking forward to that. But in the interest of time, I want to move over and talk about this other magnificent instrument. So as Deborah pans around, you guys can see this is the Johann Stein grand piano from 1784, and Stein was kind enough to leave us his inscription on the bottom boards, which Philip Belt found when he restored this thing for the Toledo Art Museum. We're not sure exactly when it entered the U.S. Sometime in the first half of the 20th century, and it's been here almost ever since. It made a quick trip to London when the Toledo Art Museum decided to deaccession this. They wanted to get the maximum price for it, so they sent it up through Sotheby's and sent it over to London. Marlowe saw it, bought it, and brought it back to Boston, and now here it is in Greenville. You'll notice all this decoration on the side. This is fairly unusual for any of these German or later Viennese pianos to be quite so encrusted in decoration. Would love to hear from the group on what you think about it. I tend to think that the decorations were probably added later, but if it was a special commission for a particular house, might have been from the time. There's nothing about it that automatically tells me, well, this has to be later than when the thing was built. So, a beautiful piano. I'll lift the lid here, and as you guys know, they were always, kind enough to dispose a lid prop stick inside, hinged and like that. And then we have a little music rest with what I think is the original silk still in place. And this leaves a lovely little grand piano that has one of the best sounds that I've heard. I think in the hands of a real artist, this is going to be quite astonishing. I believe Sylvia Berry played this one at one point when it was still with Marlowe. So, as with so many things, this one underwent the restoration that Philip Belt did, and I want to just bring things around for a moment and show you just one of the little problems that can sometimes come up even with a fairly modern restoration. So what had happened with this one, likely sometime before it was even sold by the museum, this is the rest plank, and this is a reproduction rest plank that Belt made and put in. And he followed the pattern of the original pretty precisely, including having a solid piece of wood here. In this case, a large crack developed right here in this solid piece of wood, right along that line of tuning pins. And it rendered that set of the third pins and on a few of them the second pin completely unable to hold tension. Well, it was otherwise a beautiful restoration, a well considered restoration. There's nothing about it that looks terrible or faulty. So what do you do when you have something like this? Well, we could completely replace the rest plank out, but that's going to be fairly invasive, and this historic instrument is going to go through another kind of period of troubles as things get banged around, because there's no pretty way of just doing that. There's a lot of things that have to come apart to get this rest plank out of this instrument and a new one back in this instrument. Far better if we can save what we have. And so a gentleman by the name of Ken Estey came up with a technique that I have adopted and several other people have adopted, and it involves a material that we rarely use with these early instruments, but it's an epoxy. The reason we don't use epoxies in most cases is that if I have two pieces that were glued together, there's a good chance that at some point in the future they'll need to be taken apart and glued together again. If you use epoxy, then you've just made the next guy's job 10 to 100 times more difficult, because he's got to remove all of your work before he can even get back to wood, and he may actually lose some historic surface in the process of just trying to get back to that. So we tend to use the hot hide glue wherever they used it, and we tend to use the same materials to put things together that they used. But here's an example of a material that was never meant to come apart. This rest plank here was intended to be a solid monolithic block, and now suddenly it isn't. And the process of taking it out and putting a new one in, or doing anything that effectively is a half measure, is only going to limp things along. So this material is called Epotech 301, and it's a very, very low viscosity epoxy. You're usually used to seeing epoxies that are quite thick, almost like cold honey when you're mixing them up. This stuff would be like warm cream. Viscosity of about 100 centipoise, meaning that it'll run into any crack, crevice, or opening that it is introduced to. So what I have to do is go in and make sure that I have everything sealed off, particularly underneath, because this crack went all the way through the block. If tuning pins have gone through the rest plank, then you have to seal the bottom of each one of those tuning pins. And by seal, I mean truly seal, because if it can leak through, it will. And of course the action is going to be removed. And so when we did this one, we removed the action, we sealed everything up on the bottom, and then we essentially go through and start filling up the tuning pin holes until they finally come up and make a little well at the top. Let it set up. About 72 hours is good, and then you can come back in and you can drill the holes out for the new pins. Or if you don't want any of the slight jumpiness that you can get with a pin and epoxy sometimes, you can drill it out a little bit bigger, put in a plug of wood, and then drill that to the right size, and that will work quite well. The way we've got it set up now, this is a dream to tune. This instrument really holds its tune for a long time, and we have completely solved the problem of the cracked pin block without doing anything more invasive to the instrument than simply having some blue painter's tape in place. So I just wanted to share that with you, because I think it's one of those best practices. This is one of the instruments where the sled, like you just saw for the Southwell, is actually this whole bit here. This will slide out. In this case, it's going to be much deeper. It's like 1.25 inches. It's going to slide out. The action will then drop down. Then I make sure that all the hammers are down on their rest position, and then the action can slide out. And the action on this one looks pretty much like a textbook version, even though this is reasonably early in Stein's career. So Stein, born in 1728, died in 1792. So a man in his middle age when he built this. Somewhere in the 1770s, he began to experiment with the idea of pianos, sometimes combinations of harpsichord and piano. Two of them are vis-a-vis instruments, where harpsichord on one side and piano on the other, and kind of a rectangular array. Those are quite interesting. This is more of a standard piano, with one exception. They're usually about 6 feet long. This one is closer to 7 feet long. So it has a little bit better bass than these usually have. It's more robust, more like an English sounding bass, and then the treble is just delightful. So this is going to be one of the instruments that we will have early on in our concert phase, because it is entirely concert ready. I hope I've answered most of the questions as I've described. The general philosophy for any of us who are working with these instruments is, first, do no harm, and then secondly, certain instruments will get chosen from making the sound because they're so reminiscent of the sound that you're really trying to bring forward. What did Mozart hear? What did Haydn hear when he heard the early piano? And he heard something very much like this. For the Southwell, we'll probably leave that one as a look at it sort of instrument, rather than trying to bring it back and make it play and put the thing under tension.
I've got a question for you.
Yes.
Dominic Giardino says, what pitch do you typically tune the Stein to?
So right now I have it at 415, only to say that, that's not one that anybody would totally complain about. What should it be at? As you guys know from, Bruce Haynes, the story of A, the story of what the pitch should be at kind of depends on where in the world you are, where in that town in the world you are, and then what's the date. It changes a lot, but a good number, I think, for these instruments is 420. If you start trying to bring it up to 440, things start to happen. It wasn't really intended for that tension. 415, 420, at 410, you begin to get a little bit of flabbiness, and I feel like that by 405, you can really tell that it ought to come up a little bit, because particularly in the treble, the brilliance just isn't quite there. But hopefully that answers the question. If you're playing with more modern instruments and you want to have this in the concert, then that's easy to transpose. Yes.
Beth Lee says, want to talk about the black versus white keys.
Okay, that's a good question. So in this instrument, you notice that the naturals are ebony, the accidentals are ebony with a bone top on the surface, and these all look original. The ebony is a very hard, long-wearing wood. And in Germany, it was the way keyboards were done. You wanted the contrast, but they liked that dark, hard-wearing look. And they didn't have access to ivory yet. So the English, had the trades into Africa pretty much wrapped up. For the Germans to buy ivory would have been extraordinarily expensive, and these instruments were already costly enough. So they would use things that would work. The English used the same look until about 1715, when they transformed over and began putting ivory on the naturals, and then leaving the accidentals as either ebony on the top, like a veneer, or solid ebony for the more expensive instruments.
Luke Bradley asks, does it have real Stein hollow parchment hammer sets?
So Stein actually used a mix of the hollow parchment in some of the earlier stuff, and then the wooden heads in the later. This has the later wooden head. Many of I'm not going to pull the action on this. I will tell you that many of the hammers are obviously original. There are a few replacements in here, but mostly the action is in really good shape on this one. We've reached the 30-minute mark, and we're trying to do these in 30-minute jumps. So I thank you for tuning in today. If you have questions, just post them on Facebook and I'll try to get back to you. Come back and see us on Friday. We're going to have Maria Perini playing at the museum with piano and cello. We're really looking forward to it, and I will have something out on Facebook about that concert later today.